How do investors assess the quality of boards? To start, they look for well-defined and transparent director roles and responsibilities, says Aeisha Mastagni. Welcome to BoardVision, the official podcast of the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. We share perspectives from leading corporate directors and explore what makes boards effective, including how they can help companies prepare for the future. In this episode, Mastagni, Senior Portfolio Manager in the Sustainable Investment and Stewardship Strategies Unit at the California State Teachers Retirement System, and Marcel Bucsescu, NACD Vice President of Strategic Engagement, look at the investor's perspective on board effectiveness. They explore the importance of clear disclosures, board quality red flags, and the ways in which Mastagni and other investors interact with and influence boards. Have you heard about the benefits of NACD's certification program? Today's boards operate in a dynamic and rapidly evolving world. The National Association of Corporate Directors provides directorship certification that sets the standard for high-impact board directors. It's more than certification. This is the premier program, preparing directors to successfully navigate an increasingly complex business and governance landscape. NACD's directorship certification will enable you to demonstrate commitment, deliver confidently, and create real value for your organization. Learn more and apply today at nacdonline.org. And now, your host.
Aeisha, thanks for being here today. Real excited for this conversation. I think it's a really important one. But before we jump in, I'd just really like to ask you and hear in your words, tell us a little bit about CalSTRS and your role so we understand the perspective that you bring to today's conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. CalSTRS is the California State Teachers Retirement System. We provide retirement benefits to the teachers of California and their beneficiaries. I specifically, in my role, we sit inside the investment office, and we really use our role as a significant global investor to promote sustainable business practices and public policies that are helpful to us as investors. And we engage mostly publicly traded companies, but a little bit on the private side, to really support long-term value creation and manage risk to our portfolio and the financial markets.
Well, as mentioned, I'm real excited that we're getting your perspective on this critical question of board quality, because as one of the largest pension funds in the US and around the globe, but also one of the organizations that has been engaged in this work from the investor perspective really since day one, if I may put it that way. I'd really like to ask how you think about a high-quality board from your perspective. What defines a high-quality board for you?
Sure. So I think at the end of the day, boards have a fiduciary responsibility to represent and protect the interests of shareholders. And they need to do that by exercising oversight over management, over the business needs, over the strategic direction of the company. And so for us as investors or shareholders, we're looking for actions that align with that oversight responsibility and ensuring that the board's making decisions that are in the best long-term interests of the company.
That very special and unique role that the board plays in the running of a company, and as that, I don't want to say filter, but that sort of important position between all of the respective players in the economic system is a complex one. And it's complex for you as an investor that is looking at thousands of companies across your portfolio, very dynamic environment. And so the first question that comes to mind as you think about that definition you just shared, can you talk a little bit about how you kind of go through the process of assessing board effectiveness? And through our conversation, of course, I hope we'll get into more specifics, but even at that top line introductory level.
At the end of the day, we want companies to have sustainable long-term performance so that we can pay the benefits that our hardworking California teachers have earned over the years. And so we're certainly looking for long-term company performance. But I also think that it's important to look at the disclosures a company is providing. We don't sit inside the boardroom, so we can only measure effectiveness in direct correlation with the quality of disclosures. And so some of those things that we're looking for are some of the obvious things, like we need independent board members. We need diverse individuals with diverse skills, education, experience, and personal qualities. We need individuals that have the right skills for the long-term business needs. We look at directors' other time commitments. We also look at the outgoing decisions that come out of the boardroom. Because like I said, at the end of the day, we don't sit inside the boardroom, so we can only measure, the outputs that come out from those important decisions that are made inside the boardroom.
That's a really important point you make there, as being that outside observer. It really means you're reliant on communications, other disclosures, and perhaps even conversations, those rare opportunities where you are invited in to discuss with the board or with management on a given issue. So when you think about the tools you have there, what are the ones that come top of mind for you that you're looking to first? And then when you look to go deeper, how do you navigate the various relationships and players in the board and governance ecosystem?
First and foremost, I go back to the disclosures, but I think partly what's included in those disclosures and what helps us as investors is really clear roles and responsibilities. I think about a lead director. That person should be able to set the board agenda. They should be able to conduct executive sessions as needed. And when there's a lack of transparency, that's difficult for us as shareholders. And so that might be when we might raise questions, might ask for an engagement, might use our proxy votes as one tool. These are all things that help, I think, make for more accountable boards and make for better performing boards, quite frankly.
When you think about that high performance board and the proxies again, we often hear about looking at very basic metrics like attendance at a meeting, right? But what about when you do escalate, if I can frame it that way, to engaging directly, maybe it's with a committee chair or otherwise with board members? What are you looking for in terms of that engagement, that conversation? How important is being able to engage with the board members directly for you? And again, what kind of an exchange are you looking for there?
We recognize that boards are generally comprised of very accomplished individuals. And these individuals are very busy. So we generally don't ask to speak to board members unless it's part of an escalation tool. So in some cases, it might be we're not getting the responsiveness from the executives that we need, or it could be a question of poor decision making we've seen. Maybe it's a executive compensation plan that we don't think is aligned with our best interest. Perhaps it's a decision on a merger or an acquisition. Those are things that we're going to raise with board members. Like I said, as part of either an escalation because we're not getting the response or engagement from the executive team that we need, or it might be a board level decision like executive compensation.
The other piece of the role and responsibility of the board that we at NACD think is quite critical, and it's the subject of the most recent Blue Ribbon Commission report, is that relationship between the board and the CEO. So management and the board working together while, as you highlighted, that independent oversight of the board is there, that ability to challenge. But in an environment that has become the normal for business, that's so dynamic, quite frankly, so challenging, where there's added stress on the CEO and management team, do you think about how that working relationship is between the board and management? Do you have any window into that? Anything you would share on that side?
I think the most important thing when it comes to the board and CEO relationship is to ensure that the board as a whole and its composition is really a value add to the CEO and the executive team. The board should be there to provide guidance to the management team. They should be able to provide strategic direction and, when necessary, really challenge the executive team on proposed decisions that they are planning. I always go back, we don't sit inside the boardroom, but we can see the outputs that come out. And I think that having that trust and communication and ensuring that the board is not just a sounding board to the executive team, but really providing necessary strategic oversight and feedback to the executive team.
You also wear another hat as a board member. I'm a little curious how that informs your work. But if you were to sort of think about how you go about it, and as you as an investor are looking to board members in your portfolio companies, what about the responsibility of directors to be engaged, to prepare, to make sure they're contributing fully in this environment? Do you have any thoughts there? Does that factor into your assessment at all as an investor?
It does. And I think it goes back to, once again, your commitment, especially your time commitment to companies. You mentioned my role as a director, and this job, it's not easy. It takes a lot of preparation. There are monthly board books that take several hours to read if you're really doing your job right. And so I think that in terms of public company boards and even private company boards, being able to commit the time to being really engaged is really important. And so I know that we've gotten feedback in terms of we have sort of a bright line test when it comes to overboarding, but I don't think the time commitment from being a director has lessened in any way, shape, or form over the past several years. If anything, it's gotten harder and there aren't more hours in the day. And the companies in which directors, sit on, these are complex global organizations. And so it just requires a significant amount of time to really be engaged and really ensure that you're doing what we talked about at the top of this discussion is you're exercising your oversight over management, the business needs, and the long-term strategic direction of the company.
At the outset, I mentioned, I think you are pretty uniquely positioned as probably having seen just about every iteration of a board out there and frankly seen it all. And so I want to ask the kind of the opposite or the inverse question here, which is, are there any red flags you watch out for? Any learnings that, now stand out as a lesson learned to you when it comes to the quality of the board? Anything that really catches your eye?
Yes, absolutely. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about poor performance. And I'm talking about total shareholder return, but I'm careful to acknowledge that we're looking for long-term sustainable performance from companies. And we emphasize that with every engagement. So we're not looking at quarterly earnings for each of our companies. We're not looking with a temporary dip in performance because you made a significant capital investment. We're looking for that long-term performance. So that's one. I think the other thing is if we see actions coming out of the boardroom that we don't think are in the best interests of shareholders, so something like trying to reduce shareholder rights in any way or making it harder for investors or shareholders to hold companies and boards accountable for their decisions, that's definitely a red flag. And then the last piece is what we just talked about, Marcel, which is if we have directors that are overboarded it's really hard for us to understand how those directors can be fully engaged, especially if, for example, something goes wrong. It's like, maybe you can manage being on 5 boards when everything's humming along, smoothly. But when something goes wrong and a director has a responsibility to be fully engaged with a company, that's difficult to do when there's only so many hours during the week.
Let's say you see a couple of these red flags, or you're getting other signals, feedback that isn't meeting your expectations around board quality. What are some of the levers you have to influence, to communicate that dissatisfaction, to hopefully encourage or signal that things need to get back on track? You talked a little bit about your voting, but are there other tools that you would highlight for listeners?
It definitely starts with our proxy voting. We have a fiduciary obligation to vote all of our proxies, and we treat them like all of our plan assets in terms of the due diligence and the time we spend to make sure we're voting in alignment with our beneficiaries' best interest. But I think from proxy voting, we sort of see it as a continuum or escalation path. So it kind of starts with proxy voting. There's also private engagements that we do with companies and one-on-one engagements where we can clearly communicate our concerns. I always say that engagements for us too, it's not about trying to win or lose. For us, we really look at our engagement as a risk discovery tool, and we see it as a two-way communication from the companies that we're talking to. But we also have other tools in our tool chest. We can use shareholder proposals when necessary, although I'm pretty proud of the fact that we've actually reduced the use of shareholder proposals. And that's not necessarily because we've backed away from our stewardship activities. It's actually a nature of the fact that we're being able to be more effective in those private engagements and not having to use the shareholder proposal pathway. Sort of last but not least is when we might escalate items to the board, but we see that as a tool of escalation and not necessarily our first tool we're going to pull out of the tool chest.
Since you just brought up escalating directly to the board, let me ask, historically, it has not been a practice for boards to be in direct communication with investors. And we could run through all the reasons for that. And maybe there's some you want to highlight, or maybe you have perspective, as you noted, that you actually aren't looking to that. But are there any ways that you wish the board, to the extent the board also is a part of the company communicated on these issues differently with you? Or do you think there's missed opportunities there, or ways that could better serve both you as an investor and the board in terms of efficiency and clarity, transparency, to use your word?
I think it's important for directors and boards to know that we as investors, we need consistent, comparable, and decision useful disclosures. Couple that with board level oversight over those disclosures. Where I think we get somewhat of an asymmetry is when boards or companies make reporting changes. That creates an asymmetry for us as investors. And back to what I was saying in terms of comparable and consistent information, that makes our job a lot harder. I think it's important for directors to know if a company has decided to change their disclosures, scale back on any of their disclosures, to really think through about the rationale for making those changes. Because at the end of the day, we're global investors. On the public side, we own about 10,000 public companies. And so we really need a baseline of disclosures from all of our companies in order to properly manage risk in the portfolio. And I'm not saying that companies can't enhance those or customize some of those disclosures for their own unique perspective of that company, but we do need that baseline of disclosures. And so anything that falls short of that, I think boards need to be aware and really push to provide investors with the transparency and the accountability that they need.
On a related note, we noted you're serving on a board. Some of your colleagues have gone on to serve on boards. Do you think it's helpful when you think about that board composition? How can a board bring that perspective, the investor perspective, into the room, obviously in a way that maintains their fiduciary duty as an individual board member? Do you think having that investor perspective in the room, someone that's formerly sat on the other side of the table, is helpful?
I definitely think it's helpful. When we talk about diversity, it's not just about personal characteristics, but it's about the skills and the perspective that individual board members can bring. It's the collective whole that adds up to more than just the individual. And so I think that the investor perspective is just one piece of that. I also think that it's important that boards have a mechanism to consistently evaluate themselves and make sure that the company and the board itself is set up for success. And what I mean by that is that the board composition is really built in terms of the long-term business needs of the company. And in this dynamic world that we're all operating in, that can change. And so you need to make sure that you have an effective mechanism to ensure you have proper refreshment, implement a succession plan. All of these things you need to be thinking about on an ongoing basis.
In that spirit of ongoing basis, all of these things we need to be thinking about. The world is changing rapidly, perhaps more than some of us would like. Do you think boards have done a pretty good job at maintaining pace and communicating that change, or would you like to see more? How has that evolution been from your perspective?
I think the biggest risk to a company is becoming obsolete. I think of the Blockbusters of the world and Eastman Kodak. And I think boards nowadays, they need someone on the board that can recognize the potential disruptors that are out there, or someone that has experience in industries that have faced significant disruption the past few years. I think that's a real necessary skill for most boards now. I also think the other thing that can be a little bit of a red flag for us as investors is when we see a lack of operational expertise on the board. We often see, like I said, very accomplished individuals that have run companies or run significant operations of companies, but sometimes that very expertise of a particular industry can be lacking on a board. And I think that boards need one or two individuals that have that operational expertise and can really challenge management.
Can I ask a really pointed question there along the same lines? How do you think about technology disruption and innovation, whether it's artificial intelligence now or quantum or other down the road? The big debate about whether there should be directors with explicit skill sets around cyber, AI, et cetera. Do you have a view on that?
We as investors, we're not here to tell companies or boards exactly how to operate. Companies can get that expertise in a variety of ways. They can get it through consultants. They can get it through having individuals on the board that have that particular expertise. I don't think it's our role to tell companies how to do it. I do think it is a necessary knowledge that a board needs to have, and they need to have access to resources that help equip companies for this coming change and disruption. But I'm not going to tell them exactly how to do that. I think it's up to companies to determine the best way to gain that knowledge, and then once again, communicate it through disclosures and transparency to their investors so that we know, yes, the board is gaining this knowledge. They have access to resources and they're going to use them appropriately to help guide the strategic direction of the company.
Well, Aeisha, I think that's a great note to close this conversation on. I want to thank you for sharing your perspective and for that really important conversation around board quality, and in particular, how you as an investor are able to effectively assess who's representing you in the boardroom. So Aeisha, thanks so much. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Marcel. It was great speaking with you.
That concludes this episode of BoardVision. We hope you enjoyed listening. Please subscribe and join us next time. Until then, visit nacdonline.org to stay informed about the latest resources NACD has to offer, such as memberships, certification, national or chapter events, and our content, including reports, articles, and Directorship Magazine. That's nacdonline.org. Thank you for listening.